First thing comes to my mind is how we had so many African-American businesses on Central Avenue.
My first thought about Central Avenue involves smiles, visions of having a great time.
If you went to somebody's house on Friday or Saturday and they weren't home and you wanted to see them, go down on Central Avenue.
In describing Central Avenue, it was a safe place for us.
It was really a picture for black people to be proud of.
What happened in the Central Avenue area impacted Hillsborough County.
Ultimately, I see Central Avenue as being contested part of Tampa. Memories are contested, the land has been kind of contested. Central Avenue in some ways lived and died with segregation.
If you look to your left and you see the grassy area, the great lawn at Perry Harvey Park, that's where all the businesses were. From the 1890s until 1974, when the last business closed, there were over 100 businesses, most black-owned, running north and south through the middle of this park. That was Central Avenue.
Central Avenue was my world. It spanned from Cass down to Henderson. 7 or more blocks of all black businesses, and everybody knew that I was Mr. Joyner's daughter.
When you think of Central Avenue, you think of Harlem Nights. You think of good times. There was a lot of clubs, a lot of eating places, and it was a time for where black folks had fun. It was our New York City.
If there was a parade that was predominantly black, it went down Central Avenue. In fact, everything went through some Central Avenue. At a point, if there was a funeral in West Tampa, on the way to the cemetery, they would come through Central Avenue. It was really the center of the black community.
Going in the various restaurants and stores, and especially the Lincoln Theater movie house, where we all felt like kings and queens. During the days of segregation, there were many places we could not go. We could not go to the white theaters. We couldn't go to the white restaurants and sit down and have a hamburger or whatever. And so there was a certain feeling that, am I really wanted here? They would accept our money, but we couldn't sit down and eat with other people. So that didn't happen on Central Avenue.
For us, that was told that we can't go other places. It didn't bother us because, again, we had our very own. It was about ownership. It was good to see African-American business owners, like Mr. Joyner that owned the Cotton Club, Mr. Rodriguez, Attorney Rodriguez, who's a lawyer there. During that era, they realized that their way out of poverty was owning their own business.
What it represented was the exposure of what it was like to be an entrepreneur. It was part of your life. So you grew up saying, hey, I can be anything, because everything is here.
One of the sort of ironic effects of the physical segregation of peoples is the creation of these black communities, black business districts especially, that again only exist because of the inability of black people to move freely in the white community.
I think you reflect the racism that existed very strongly in this town. Black people couldn't have jobs of any significance back during that period of time. And the few, even on Central Avenue, there were 1 or 2 people that were white. The drugstore was white-owned and run.
Tampa was in many ways a typical Southern segregated town. But to be honest with you, we were very comfortable in that surrounding. We made the best of what life had given us.
The larger context here would be the sort of the movement from the Jim Crow system, which is in place across the South, including Florida, since really the turn of the 19th into the 20th century is when you get the rise of segregation statutes, the disfranchisement of African-American voters, and the sort of rise of racial violence in the form of lynching.
What we're talking about when we talk about the long struggle for civil rights is the fact that the struggle for the equality of African Americans in this country actually began in the 1920s and 1930s, and some would even say it goes all the way back to Reconstruction.
Well, what Tampa was like when I was growing up, of course, it was in the 1940s. It was the Jim Crow era in the South, and so it was a very segregated world. But it was also a very protected world. And that's the world that I grew up in. I understood that the difference between the white fountain and the one that said colored. I know that if I wanted to eat downtown, that was an impossibility.
You had segregation. You got on the bus, you had to ride the back of the bus. Going to school, I had to walk about 3 miles to school. There was no school bus available to me.
During the Jim Crow years, there were very limited venues for black people. There are very few places where people could feel safe. So really, it was not just about surviving, but it was about thriving, despite whatever kinds of racial terror that existed at that time.
World War II is an important turning point in terms of African American activism and agitation. One historian has called World War II veterans the shock troops of the modern civil rights movement. So these people go to fight for freedom overseas, and then they come home and say, you know, we're fighting for democracy overseas. What about democracy here at home? It's called the Double V campaign for double victory. Victory over fascism abroad, victory over Jim Crow at home.
You begin to see the desegregation of the military in 1948 by Harry Truman. That's another instance in which the media as a whole, both African American and the white media, see as a seminal and salient event. And then you move into Brown versus Board. But really, when the white press begins to really understand movements and begin to understand that struggle and begin to recognize that it's an issue, you begin to see that in the 1950s with the Montgomery bus boycott and with the Little Rock Nine.
Hank Klivanoff, co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Race Beat, he talks about this in terms of the white press, and particularly the New York Times. The white press started following the story in the South. There was just too much going on to avoid and ignore the story anymore. And once the television crews started showing up, things began escalating from there, both in terms of the movement and the power of the movement.
Brown versus Board of Education decision had been made, and it was pretty obvious in the late 1950s that civil rights was inevitable, that it was going to happen, that there was going to be integration coming to Tampa. And so Elder Banfield got some other black ministers and black leaders together. The Wolf brothers got some of the white business leaders together and ministers in the community. And that was the beginning of the Mayor's Biracial Committee.
The Mayor's Biracial Committee officially was organized in 1959. Cody Fowler became very interested in it. The Wolf brothers spoke to him. Cody Fowler for many years was an attorney, perhaps the first white attorney to, on a regular basis, take the cases of black people who needed legal advice. He was known for that all the way back to the 1920s.
So the Biracial Committee consisted of people like Cody Fowler, Robert Thomas, who headed Port. Tampa Merchants Association was interested because they didn't want business disrupted. On the black side, you had people like the Reverend A. Leon Lowry, who was a prominent, probably the most prominent minister in Tampa, and an NAACP leader. You had Perry Harvey Sr., who was head of the Longshoremen's Union. C. Blythe Andrews Sr., who was the publisher of the Florida Sentinel Bulletin.
So locally, the editors often were involved in local politics. They could dig up information. And in a way, it attempted to not only inform readers, but it attempted to pressure local officials, right, to try to change the situation.
Everybody respected Reverend Lowry. He was truly a leader, and Perry Harvey. They were people who negotiated, who was strong, who stood up and spoke up for us. And as a student, we knew that this group was out negotiating to make it happen. They were working for the good of this community. They wanted Tampa to do it the right way.
They were people who were willing to take some risk, but calculated risk, if you will. And so to avoid, I guess, making mistakes or doing things too fast, I think there was just this methodical working through what do we think will happen if we do this, or how fast should we move with that.
But this is very much by design. Commercial elites of the city recognizes that disruption is bad for business, and that if measured, cautious integration is better than disruption and unrest. So this comes to be called the Tampa Technique.
The Tampa Technique, which was a process by which whites and blacks leaders cooperated with each other to try to control the pace and development of racial and civil rights progress. And they viewed Tampa as a New South, what was termed New South city, in which there would be business development, real estate, of course, and finally tourism.
There was an attempt to seize the moment. So, you know, they're willing to listen. Let's try to see what we can do to make improvements without causing a whole lot of problems, without, you know, without necessarily making extraordinary demands.
On February 1st, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, several students at North Carolina A&T University, there were 4 of them initially, who went to an F.W. Woolworth department store downtown, just as we had one here in Tampa on Franklin Street. They sat at the lunch counter. They were not served. They were refused service, but they just kept coming back, and they kept coming back, and they kept coming back, and then more students joined them.
Well, that's what sparked our interest here. I say they were some courageous young men. They were all college students there, and when it hit the news, television and newspapers, and then I thought about our situation here. I said, well, why not us? Why don't we get involved?
One of the truly significant things about the sit-in movement is that it's students for the first time who are young people who are going to be at the center of that particular branch of civil rights activism. The NAACP has been working for decades at this point. You have Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So if the NAACP is the lawyers and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is the ministers, the sit-in movement's going to be the students.
Clarence Fort was a 20-year-old barber from Alachua County, from Hawthorne, Florida, who had come to Tampa looking for a way to make a good life for himself. And because he was a barber, he was independently employed. So he didn't have to worry about his boss firing him or getting in any trouble because he was stirring up trouble, so to speak. But it was Clarence Fort that took that very important first step.
When the sit-in came in February 29th, 1960, it gave the biracial committee really its first major challenge. Now, part of the reason that you'll see the sit-in in Tampa is that the impetus from the original sit-ins came from youth council members of the NAACP. Through a variety of ways, kind of a network of communications, those in Tampa got the idea to carry on the sit-ins in downtown Tampa, first against Woolworths and then against Woolworths and Crests.
Well, I sat down and wrote out my plan, and then I turned it over to Robert Saunders at the NAACP office and told him, see, the only way we can get it done, I'm going to go out to the high schools and meet with the presidents of the student councils and let them recruit some kids.
And my husband, the late George Edgecombe, Hillsborough County's first African-American judge, was at the time the president of the student body at Middleton High School. And so 2 of the crucial people that were part of that sit-in were the presidents of the student body at Blake and at Middleton, which were the premier high schools, or the only high schools at the time in Tampa for African Americans.
That was in February of 1960. I was in 11th grade. Clarence Fort came to Middleton and talked to George and organized us to participate. He is actually the living embodiment of a true organizer and one who sought out the students to come so that we too would have a part in this historic event.
In watching television, and I saw what happened at some of the other cities around the South, I really didn't know what to expect, but it was just one of the things that I felt I had to go through. I said to myself, whatever happened, it happened. I didn't know if I would get beaten. I don't know if they would bring the dogs.
We went and sat, and they immediately closed the counter, and people stared and looked and under their breath said a few things, but we engaged each other and just sat there and asked for service, but we didn't get it. We were nonviolent, orderly students addressing our grievance to Tampa and to the world.
One thing I give Tampa credit for, we had a very moderate mayor at the time. Tampa was really on the move, and they really didn't want that to happen.
And it's at this point that the biracial committee and the mayor decided that they would need to do something to prevent any violence from taking place, because in some of these other cities there would be violence.
Because of the support of Mayor Julian Lane, there was very little violence in Tampa. Now, there had been violence in other places, and we began to see more and more of this on the 6 o'clock news in Birmingham and many other places. There was very little violence in Tampa.
The city fathers got together, the biracial committee, and they got me in a meeting and asked me if I would agree to give them time to work it out. And I just told them that I didn't know how long I could hold the kids off. So they assured me that they were working on it and give them time to work out a peaceful solution with the merchants.
Well, we never knew what the people who were in charge would do. But we did what we had to do. We sat in and demanded things change. And I was a part of working very closely with the Clarence Ford.
So in September, what we did not use the children from the schools to integrate. We used James Hammond's group, the Young Adults for Progressive Action. We wanted more older people. We wanted professional people. And we decided that every store in the city that had lunch counters, we would send 2 people in to eat on a trial basis at 10 in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And what we did, we got away from the rush hours. We didn't want a lot of fanfare when there were a lot of people around.
So the Tampa Technique is the way that the sit-in process is negotiated, the way that the desegregation of the downtown area commences. But it's also, I think, really important to recognize that it's also packaging on the part of the city fathers and the commercial elite, right? This is not just out of the goodness of their hearts. This has to do with money. This has to do with bringing people to Tampa. And the Tampa Technique becomes a way that the city presents itself to investors, to the state, people outside the city. It's sort of the notion of, look what we're able to do, look what we did here.
Now, Florida, in the late 50s, very early 60s, was lucky to have Governor Leroy Collins, who was certainly not a desegregationist. He was not an integrationist, but he was a moderate. If you compare that to governors like George Wallace, it's a whole different state leadership here.
The biracial committee began as a local response, but then it became a statewide response because Governor Leroy Collins made a really important speech March 20th, 1960, where he's responding to all these sit-ins that are happening. And basically, there's people on both sides of the racial aisle asking him to just take a hard line. You can hear the frustration in his voice.
Well, I want to talk to you about race relations. Now, none of us have all the answers to this situation, friends. I think all of us are part right and part wrong, because when there's division, there's suspicion, that there is fear, there's distrust, and ultimately there's hate. And hate consumes and destroys. We've got extremists on one side, and we've got extremists on the other. But where are the people in the middle? Why aren't they talking? Why aren't they working? They must start working.
There were still businesses, the movie theaters, for instance, bowling alleys, swimming facilities, cafeterias that didn't desegregate voluntarily.
After sit-ins, we moved to the theaters. Then the beaches, we had wait-in. But I can remember a time down at the Tampa Theater on Franklin Street. We tried to get interest there, and the clerk had to tell us, because of our policies, I cannot sell you a ticket. We had 20 people in line, 20 students, and she had to tell every one of us that. So after she finished with that, she quit. She quit her job. She told the manager, you come do it, I'm not gonna do it.
The process of gaining equality in many, many different areas was always gradual, if you will. First of all, it's about a system, a historic system that's sort of grounded in people's minds and in people's hearts. So, and that takes a lot to change.
What was really an important part of what I saw growing up in education in Hillsborough County at the time, it was teachers who understood that at some point in time the world was going to change. They probably would not have predicted when and how, but there was this kind of commitment to getting us ready for whatever that change was going to be.
Those are the people, along with my parents, who pushed me. And they made me do right, and they said, you can be anything you want to be. They took a personal interest in each and every one of us. We got nurtured by our teachers and attention, and they made sure that we got our work done.
If you had to do the tier system, you'd say Blake and Middleton was at the bottom because they're all black. And then Jefferson, which is a small school, had a lot of Hispanics. And then you would have your Hillsborough and your plant during that time.
It was a very difficult problem because it was hard to do it immediately, since black education had been, for the most part, underfunded. Education was separate, but it was never equal in the South.
You have to consider that 1963 was really a very eventful year, and it made such a tremendous impact. Of course, we had President John Kennedy come to Tampa, and for me, I heard him say, now ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I was in 8th grade at Just Junior High School.
And here at home, what we're trying to do is also simple, though its execution is difficult. And that is to educate our children so that they are able to maintain themselves and their families and this free system. I believe it is the united will of all of our people, protecting the security of the United States and providing an opportunity for our people. That's what we stand for.
So this little 13-year-old girl went home and told my mother, I'm gonna leave Just and go over to West Tampa Junior High School. My mother kept saying to me, why you?
If you've got a strong support system and you have people who are behind you, encouraging you and inspiring you and telling you why this was important to do, I think you felt safe in doing it. You certainly had your fears. Being a teenager is a difficult time anyway, and just couple that with changing in your learning environment, going into something that's absolutely strange. It wasn't like you had a lot of knowledge about what this was all about because it was a new phenomenon for this country.
I left 8th grade, all black school, segregated Just, to go to West Tampa, and there was 3 of us that left Just. Henry Lee White, myself, and Patricia Killens. And we went there, and it was a big adjustment. It was a rude awakening.
We had the first 2 white teachers to teach at Middleton High School in East Tampa when I was in 11th grade. And prior to that, all of the students were black, all the teachers were black, the principal, all the administrators. And if you lived in a segregated neighborhood, you didn't see white people on a regular basis.
That was a long time after Brown versus Board of Education, but schools were segregated even up until I graduated from high school, and I graduated from Tampa Catholic in 1969.
Horrible time, and the time that really made me realize prejudice and racism and just could kill your spirit was when they closed Jefferson down in 1967, and I went to Hillsborough High School in '68. You realize it wasn't just about black and white or Hispanic, it's about economics. And Hillsborough and Plant High School was the two upper class where all the money was.
Opening up schools in Hillsborough County, after 1969, that had consequences for the black community that not all people saw. Some did. If you're going to merge school system, what's going to happen to the teachers and principals and administrators in the black schools? And the schools themselves were real sites of community pride.
It was what we knew. It's kind of interesting when people ask us to compare. I can do that now because having been in education for 52 years, I could definitely see the big difference and the contrast. But at the time, it was all that I know. It was natural. It was expected. It was all that was available at the time.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to take this occasion to talk to you about what that law means to every American. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
Okay, so by 1964, I think Tampa had sort of been gradually moving toward some kind of equality. Tampa was just like any other city, not so much in terms of violence. We didn't have dramatic violence like in other southern cities. But I think that there are a lot of different ways that Tampa could show itself as the South.
What the white civic leaders had worked for was the threat of a Civil Rights Act. They were working to avoid the passage of federal legislation because they could not design how that federal legislation would work, or they couldn't control what it did.
Civil Rights Acts, in terms of how it played itself out in Tampa, was a greater sense of freedom about being able to operate in this environment now. You have to remember that it's interesting, blacks knew more about whites than whites knew about blacks. And so we were still kind of a mystery in some ways.
What happens in this post-civil rights moment? And there's this expectation, I think, among much of the white population that civil rights is now done. That, right, we have the Civil Rights Act, we have the Voting Rights Act, that is over, let's move on. And what African American communities across the urban United States in the late 1960s are saying, in a lot of cases, is no, we're not done. There are still issues to be addressed.
I don't feel that in the areas of housing there were major transformations until much later.
Central Park Village was built in 1955. It replaced the scrub, at least in that area between Orange Avenue and Nebraska Avenue. So the scrub went away. All of these wood frame homes that were barely standing, many of them that had been sitting there 60, 70 years, they went away. Public housing came into that area, Central Park Village.
Everything that existed for white people in their communities existed right there in Central Avenue, and right behind Central Avenue was Central Park Village housing projects.
After World War II, there's a lot of federal dollars available for housing. You see Tampa taking this money and using it for Progress Village. So I think the strategy was that Tampa would spend federal dollars on black constituents. Local money would still, for the most part, go towards the wealthier communities.
The area east of Nebraska Avenue, where Maryland Avenue was, and that Maryland Avenue project, that was the first time in the history of the city of Tampa that African American-led organizations actually were able to participate in redevelopment.
A number of scholars have written about how urban renewal, the interstate system, and again, federal home mortgages were used to break up these minority enclaves. That's where you get the definition of these areas being designated as slums and slum removal and so on, and this was the problem.
Progress Village was born and they were trying to find a place to relocate African Americans that was in that part of the city and in other parts of the city where the interstate went through, like West Tampa, Culver City, places like that. And they created Progress Village.
And the people who moved to Progress Village were those who were being displaced because of urban redevelopment, the changing of highway patterns through the city. And so they set this up as a model community. It was a segregated community. That was not interracial housing back then.
It helped to reproduce what we talk about, a number of social differences in terms of who gets displaced, who has power, who has a right to the city.
Basically, urban renewal, which seemed like a good idea initially, but really it ended up being a strategy for moving Black people out of the city and really kind of pushing them to move into areas that were designated as Negro areas.
The interstate system came in mid-60s. It was during President Eisenhower's administration. During World War II, he saw in Germany this Autobahn system where you have high-speed roadways that connect cities. When the roadway gets to a major urban center, it's a beltway around the center. And if you want to visit within that urban center, use local roads. So that was the original thinking around it until politics reared its ugly head.
The major highways that are built through a lot of downtown areas tend to target minority communities, which from the perspective of urban planners, these are classified as slums. From the perspective of residents, they are thriving communities and business areas.
The highway construction that was going to, open up Tampa to more rapid commerce and transportation came at a loss for the poorest, the victims of a system that had kept them out of the economic and political development of this country.
That was this level of displacement that was combined with urban renewal programs that came along a few years later. And you have to remember during this time, a lot of legislation that we take for granted was not in the books. The Interstate Highway System Act preceded the Civil Rights Act by 8 years.
In a lot of ways, we were witnessing the demise of the community. Also, there were other opportunities that opened up so that geographically, we had access to places that we hadn't before.
I guess the interstate for the community as a whole, what's saying is symbolic of progress. Now we've got this way we can travel faster and quicker and that kind of thing. But it really destroyed many of our community, African American communities, split them up. People had to move to other places. It was a demise for many African American communities. It was, yeah, death, if you will.
Civil rights movement of the early 1960s obviously accomplished an extraordinary amount for African Americans across the United States, but there's an awful lot that is left undone.
The Biracial Committee didn't just close up shop, it actually evolved into a city agency called the Commission on Community Relations. That was, in effect, the outgrowth of the Biracial Committee. And it was headed by Jim Hammond.
Jim Hammond started a program that preceded Head Start. Before there was a Head Start program, federal program, Jim Hammond had a program doing the same kinds of things with very young children. He was the representative of Black people to the power structure for several years in the 1960s.
The city of Tampa was a racist city, and Black folks basically had only menial kind of jobs, nothing significant. And one of my responsibilities, I took it on to get people to hire Black folks.
When it comes to African American constituents, Tampa provided nothing. No parks, no health care, no special education programs, nothing to the African American community. The Urban League and other volunteer community organizations had to fill in the gap.
They couldn't see a way out of their situation because everybody they knew was in the same condition they were in. And living in public housing in Central Park Village, it was a hill to climb.
And what's particularly interesting, just at the height of the civil rights success, just when Americans were congratulating themselves, white Americans in particular, that they had done the right thing by ending, by law, desegregation. It's at that very moment that in the summer of 1964 and the summer of 1965, there was an explosion of racial agitation.
In Newark, New Jersey, it happens in Detroit, it happens in Watts in Los Angeles, California, but it doesn't happen here because this is progressive Tampa. This is the city of the Tampa Technique. The 1967 riot shows that the negotiated agreements of the early 60s leave a lot undone, and I think that's a really important point.
At June 11th of '67, I had just come back to work. My partner and I was riding in Ybor City. The call came out that there had been a burglary down south of Kennedy Boulevard, down in the warehouse area. Some young guys, and they were running back towards Central Park Project.
Newspaper accounts, we've been able to find quite a few of those stories from that era. Talked about what happened on that June day when Martin Chambers, who was 19 years old, and some other young men, and we really can't tell you a lot about those other young men who were involved in this situation, but Martin was running away from a burglary. That's all we really know. He was trying to get back home to his apartment in Central Park Village, and Officer Jim Calvert fired one single shot, shot Martin in the back.
We were the first vehicle to arrive around on Short Harrison. They had called an ambulance, and the ambulance they said they couldn't find where we were. This reporter from the Florida Sentinel, Reverend Newman, was there, and he said, look, don't let this kid die out here on the street. Get him in the police car and get him to the hospital right away. So the officer that had shot him drove the police car, and the other officer, Robert Oates, who was there, he was in the back seat holding him. And they got him in the car and they drove him to Tampa General Hospital. My partner and I got his mother in our car, and we followed them and took her over to Tampa General.
What actually happened is always hard to say, but the policeman shot him. Just as the sit-ins were part of a communication network and people saw things now on television, as a result, in this hot night, word spread.
A crowd gathered around, of course, to see what was going on, and people were very upset. Some people said he had his hands raised, he was giving up. Some people said he was trying to climb over a fence. He was just trying to get away. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have anything that was a danger to anybody else. But he was shot, he did die, and there were 3 days and nights of civil disturbances.
We heard the news, on TV about a young black guy got shot in the back. Say he was running from the police, and the police shot him in the back. And next thing we know is a big uproar, with riots and things like that, where people was saying he was unjust shot.
We left Tampa General several hours later. The riot was in full force, buildings were burning, and incidents were happening all over Central Avenue at that time.
All hell broke loose, and these guys just start tearing up everything they could tear down, blow up, just tear down in Tampa.
I guess I felt like most African Americans at the time, the sense of injustice, a little bit some fear. Was this going to take us back? What's it going to do to our communities? Because unfortunately, the riots and all the devastation and destruction occurred in the black community, which was always, for me, a sad kind of commentary that what was being destroyed was our own property in our community, that kind of thing.
The looting and the burning and not knowing the uncertainty of what was happening over there at Central Avenue, it was like a shock to all of us. Because again, for the protest that was going on, we were burning up our own businesses. And you still see that sometimes today, okay? But most people felt they had no other outlet. that the systems and the powers to be was not listening to the blacks of this community.
Essie Mae Reed told me that she remembered the day that Martin was shot and killed. He had 27 cents in his pocket. And that was not unusual. These kids didn't have anything. Their parents, were just barely getting by. The state attorney's office ruled it justifiable homicide. State Attorney Antonori made that ruling, and so people were very, very, very upset.
Nothing was done to these guys. That was the time that white people could do anything they wanted to do to black people, and basically nothing happened. And this was the role that I played to make things happen, change, and I didn't give a damn, really.
They called in the troops. The National Guard was activated, came in to help secure the city, and things calmed down for a while. But what really calmed down the riots was when they organized James Hammond and some of the other leaders in the community organized a group called the White Hats.
And I was able to get the city to allow me to buy the white hats. I guess there were about 20 hats, and had these guys identified as the white hats. And they wore hats so the white cops wouldn't shoot them. And then I got the mayor to get me in charge of really manning this whole situation.
The motivation was to try to keep the peace, try to keep any more people from getting hurt, and basically try to keep people from tearing up properties.
We had 4 buildings that were burned down on Central Avenue. A lot of those businesses closed and never reopened. But we did have a group of young men who became known as the White Hats. And many of them had actually participated in some of the violence on Central, but they became the problem solvers and the ambassadors for peace, the White Hats.
They created the White Hats and James Hammond and that group, and came together to bring about some peace and quell a disturbance, because it was not a peaceful time in this community.
Clearly, the Tampa Technique had not prevented this kind of violence from occurring. The Tampa Technique was good at diffusing confrontations, but the people who were involved in the confrontations were connected to those who wanted to resolve those problems. The riot was something outside of that system.
When you had any kind of racial strife during that period, the press itself begins to cover the story. And what tends to happen is that the mainstream press covers it as a singular event. And that's where we begin to have problems, because it doesn't show what were the issues that led up to that event, and that sort of forced that event to occur.
You could say that a lot of the media did something similar to what they're doing now, right? They parachute in, they get the story, and then they leave. Some outlets did a better job than others of providing some context. The Nation magazine did a fabulous job, actually, in the 1960s.
I challenge people to go back and take a look at the Kerner Commissioner report.
In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson creates a commission to study this urban unrest across the United States. It's headed by a guy named Otto Kerner.
To look into, what's the cause of this and what's behind it. And it's a number of the issues that were never addressed that we still see today.
They produced this list of causes. It's police violence, it's lack of educational opportunities, it's lack of employment opportunities, it's substandard living conditions, a lack of availability of housing, it's lack of recreational facilities.
One thing that the riots did for Tampa, it sort of exposed the ugly parts of the city. The poverty, the poor health conditions, the living conditions, the fact that these young people were just kind of left to fend for themselves.
The ring of the head of mistrust, again, that maybe this community had been working hard to overcome, and this incident was kind of an impetus to moving it back to a place that we had worked so hard to move from.
We need to understand these explosions of urban racialized violence throughout the late 1960s as these are political acts, right? These are not random acts of violence. These are people denied a formal sort of stake in the political process, effectively disfranchised, who are making their voices heard in an alternative sort of way.
So between the riot, integration, and the interstate coming through, that pretty much sealed the death knell for Central Avenue. And this all happened in the late 1960s.
Once that competition began, you know, after integration, then it was really an unfair struggle from then on for most black businesses. So Central Avenue, essentially by, you know, the late 60s, was a shell of its former self.
People were thinking about closing their businesses anyway because of urban renewal and because of the highway coming through. So there was a lot going on that sort of spelled the demise of the area.
The black world that had been contained within Central Avenue it branched out, and people were going other places and doing things. And then with all of the destruction that occurred, and that all contributed to the decline of Central Avenue. And then the next thing you know is the interstate. And the exit to downtown at Jefferson and Scott was where Central Avenue was. That was it. It just wiped out everything.
The interstate hurt Central Avenue a lot because it wiped out a good bit of the residential areas that supported Central Avenue. And when you take out the residents, hey, you got no support.
African Americans may have lived in those enclaves and owned their homes. You had eminent domain. You know, if the city says that this is the benefit of the greater good, again, you're in the South, what voice do you have to fight City Hall if they, you know, so the businesses were lost, the homes were lost. We know within that area over 3,000 structures were displaced.
It was devastating because we lost that rich history, that safe place for many of us to go to. We lost the wealth of the businesses and the business owners during that time.
Couldn't compensate for the years of living in community and all of the goodness and the goodwill and all that Central Avenue had brought forth, the camaraderie, the community, all of that was devastated.
We have never been able to recapture in this community that same sense of unity, of family, of being very supportive of each other. We're still struggling with that today.
As a whole, we're not moving forward the way that we could when we had a district. Bought everything we needed there, except an automobile. That's the only thing they didn't sell on Central Avenue. So, but I think we can learn from the successes of those people who built Central Avenue if we know more about their story. And the park is a good place to start.
But we welcome you to a place of dreams where children's voices romp and scream, for what surrounds us now in stone was a wonder once of flesh and bone.
Just the fact that we've got a park named after Perry Harvey and a park that's sort of geared towards African American history is really remarkable when you consider the long view of Tampa's history and the fact that parks were never something that was sort of given to the African American community. A demonstration of a complete change from the way Tampa operated before, say before 1960.
I try and get through there once or twice a month. I do have a picture of portrait there in the park of me sitting at the lunch counters under the civil rights history of Tampa. They have one space for that. It's a nice park. I don't know how well it's attended.
A wonderful exhibition of our history and people who made a difference long before many of these young folks were born. It gives them a smidgen, a little knowledge about what it was like. But they have a responsibility to read and find out and talk to people who lived during that era.
I'm interested in how people use it. I'm interested in how it teaches people about Tampa's African American history. Is it meant to do that? Or is it meant to portray itself as honoring Black history, but really attracting people so that they can live in those apartments that are built there?
It's recognized, but is it taught? How does that history and that reconciliation get ingrained into how we do policing, how we do hiring in the city, how we tell that story every day. It's not something that somebody should have to go to Perry Harvey Park to see that.
People talk about a post-racial era, or they talk about color blindness, they talk about a lot of different things, but when people are still angry, when people are still upset over poverty issues or lack of health care, lack of education, and these issues are still going on, so it's absolutely critical, I believe, to understand the context in order to break these cycles and to break some of these structural and institutional racism.
Watching in recent years the incidences of racial unrest, most stemming from police brutality in Ferguson, Missouri with Michael Brown, and Baltimore with Freddie Gray. These moments where communities sort of rise up and protest against the sort of systematic, racialized violence. You know, to watch the popular press deal with this, there's a sense of where does this anger come from? And the answer is history. We have an instructive case in Tampa.
It just needs to be known what Central Avenue was like and how important it was to the black community and to the city of Tampa. It gave young people a sense of belonging and something to strive toward.
The creation of a community is about holding on to hope that there will be a brighter day. It's about self-sufficiency, self-determination. It's about creativity, and we need to know that.
Central Avenue should teach us a great lesson as black people as to what you can accomplish, what you can achieve when you work together.
They started out with a dream and a vision, and they worked hard. They made many sacrifices, but all these people never forgot their community. They always wanted to make it better for the next generation. They were proud African-American men and women.
That is better than any Hollywood movie could create, because no one would have thought in 1960 that Jim Crow was going to fall. Was not much different than South Africa was until Nelson Mandela could free it. We had our own Nelson Mandelas, and you look back and you say, wow, these folks did that.
I think when they look at what we did, and it's important for us to keep it in the limelight or to keep it out there in front of them so that they can see where there's struggle, there's gain, and there's no gain without struggle.
So I think it's very important that people to recognize that and to recognize from which we have come.
And I think our students, both black and white, even our community, ought to know about Central Avenue and what it meant in that period of time and the history of it and the implications of what happened to it, so that we're careful that as we talk about redevelopment, as we talk about expanding opportunities in Tampa, that the mistakes aren't made so the same fate won't occur again.